Just want to talk about one of our sponsors quick, Terra AI. Growing software teams need to ship at a high velocity with a simple, agile process, which that is true. Designed for speed and simplicity, Terra AI helps engineering teams deliver on their sprints. Laracon attendees get Terra for free. So I mean, we can't even do any better than that. Like, that's as good as it gets. So definitely check them out. They're a new sponsor. Really appreciate you guys giving them a look. The product looks really nice. Right at terra.ai/Laracon. You can check that out. So definitely give Terra a look. Thanks a lot to Terra for sponsoring Laracon. All right. Now on to the show. Let me turn off my share.
Yes.
And you should be able to take over.
Okay, let's see. Oh, I have to restart Zoom. Okay. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, no I will do it quickly.
Yep. When everybody had to re-download, update Zoom, sometimes then had you do another restart with the permissions change. It's all right. He'll be back. I believe he'll come right in as a speaker. There we go.
Yes, it should be good now. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. Okay. I didn't get a response from you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, perfect.
Yep, and I can see your screen, so you're all good. So
awesome.
Take it away.
Okay.
Thanks.
So today I will be talking about pizzas. I meant routing, of course. We're doing routing. I have a small disclaimer. You will get hungry after this talk, so there's a lot of pizzas in here. So just be sure to order your pizza already. And there's no pizza without pineapples, right, Eric? So this is especially for him. So yeah. Okay, let's get started. I'm Bouwmann. I work at Enrise. I'm a top contributor at Laracast. I'm the writer of Laravel Secrets, and I'm a partner at PingPing. So definitely check those out. And at Enrise, we are the new standard in organizing. So there's no management, no board, but the professionals, the developers, take control. So that's really awesome. Okay, let's get started. Today's menu. So we will first go over the basics of routing. How do you register a route? How does that work? And then we go over the routing cycle. So we go from how the route is registered inside the framework and how it's retrieved, how it's matched against the URL. And we will go over route model binding. We will look into another use case for the router and eventually look into some best practices. Okay, so if you start a new Laravel project, you always start with this routes file, and it's pretty empty at the beginning. There's only one route with a callback to the home page, and it returns a simple view. So this directory or this file, this web.php file, lives inside the routes directory inside your project. And Laravel comes with 4 routes out of the box. So we have the web.php, api.php, the channels.php for broadcasting. And I think Marcel will tell you more about it. And then we finally have the console.php, which is for commands. And I believe Nuno will talk about that later. So today we will only focus on the web.php file because that's really enough for this talk already. And in essential, the api.php file is the same as the web.php file, except it has some different conditions. So registering a route. Well, we have different ways of registering a route. And if you work with Laravel, you probably have seen all of these examples before. So since Laravel 8, we use this tuple syntax where you define the class and a method. And as you can see here, a route exists out of two parts. So we have the URL. So in this case, /users/ a variable called user. And then we have the connected action to it. So the class that will, or a callback that will execute the action and return a response for us. And every route, for every route, we can set certain conditions. We can give it a name, we can add middlewares, we can add other stuff to it. And we will look into those options later. So the most common way in Laravel is to use a controller. And as you can see here, we have two options. We have a basic controller, or we have an invocable controller. And we also call this a single action controller. And they both work. Then we have the invocable method like Christoph showed us just a few minutes ago. And the final option is, of course, a callback where you just return something. And if you have more functionality, then of course a controller is more recommended. But a callback is very useful if you want to do something quickly. If you want to try something out, whatsoever. And one important thing is both of these options support dependency injection. So even if you use the callback, you can still use dependency injection in there. And we will later see how that works under the hood. So if you use Laravel, you probably have registered multiple routes at once for one resource, for example, for a post. And in this case, we register all routes for a post that are possible. So if you have, for example, a CRUD view where you can create, read, update, and delete a post, then you need all of these routes. And this is also what we call a resource. And as you can see here, Laravel offers multiple ways to register routes with different HTTP verbs. So we have the get method, post, put, patch, and delete. And they all have their purpose to handle certain things in a certain way. And because we have these different methods, we can reuse the same URL. So that's really important here. If we do use a different method, we can reuse that URL, but we need to give it a different name. Just to make sure that they use a different action. But since we always match on the action, so on the get, post, put, or delete, we can use that to determine what URL and what action is connected to it. And you can also see that post here is a variable, and we will talk about that later when we dive into the route model binding. Then we see how these parameters work. So if we run php artisan list on the command line, you will get an output of all of these routes. And this is very useful. You can already see what's going on, what are the routes doing, what is their name, what is the URL, what's the action connected to it, and eventually also middlewares. And there's an extra option called compact, which you can pass on the command line, which gives you a cleaner overview of the routes. And this is especially useful if you have a lot of packages installed, for example, Horizon, that offers you extra URLs, but they also come with a very long action name because there's this huge namespace from the package that shows the actual action. And sometimes it's not readable on your screen anymore and it will go to multiple lines. So the compact option really helps you here. And so Laravel registers these routes automatically. So you can call registering routes inside the service container, a service provider from your package. And that's very useful as well. So there are multiple ways to put something inside the router. So before I showed you a list of all these routes you can register by typing them out yourself. Laravel has a convenient method called resource to register this automatically for you. And as you can see, it registers the same routes for us. So we don't have to type them all out on our own. It is a time saver, but it can also be a pain in the ass if you only need a few routes from the resource, or if you need to add more routes that are connected to the post resource in this case. So Laravel also has some methods for that. And in this case, we can either say we want to remove some, or we only want to show a certain few, or we only want to register a few of them, for example, using the only method. And then you can still add multiple methods in there as well. So you can still add your own method to the controller. It doesn't limit you if you're using the resource option to register a route. And if we look at the output, then we get a lot of routes there as well. And then there are some more options for resources where you can register a middleware, for example. So it will add the middleware to all those registered routes from the resource. And we can change the name, for example. In this case, we change the name of all the resource of all the routes that are registered using the resource. And another option is replacing a single item from the resource with a different name, like we do in the below example. So the downsides of this this approach is that this resource registers multiple routes, but it's really hard to see what routes are all registered. So you need to run the php-artisan route list command for a better overview. So I'm personally more a fan of writing out all these routes yourself. And well, I will talk about it later, why that is. Okay. And even if you register all these routes, at some point it becomes really complicated and you want to group things together. And that's where route groups comes in. For example, if you have a certain prefix or the auth middleware is very common to put into a group. So that's where, So that's where all these extra options come in. So in this case, we register a route and we gave it a name, a prefix, a middleware, a domain, and eventually we put an action to it. So in this case, get. And the same goes for the action below it, patch. And these are very useful, but they basically have the same options, but you don't want to write out both of these routes all the time. So instead, you can put them in a group. And the group here basically applies all the previous items to all the routes that are in the group. So that's very useful because we don't want to clutter our routes file with all these routes that have all of these options. We just put them in a group together to make it more readable. But even these groups, you can even nest these groups and make it even more complicated. And as you can see, that's already getting a little bit more unreadable. There's so many routes here, but it's still the best way to go. And as you can also see here, we, in this case, because we use this group, we can also apply new groups in there with different conditions. For example, the throttle middleware is only applied to one route in this case. And the verified middleware is only applied to 2 routes in this case. And the route list command gives you a really nice overview of what's going on there. And there's one more cool thing here. If you run the php-artisan route list command, you can also pass in the columns you want to see inside the table. So in this case, we decide to do the method, the name, the action, and the middleware as well. So that's also very useful if you want to try that out on your own computer. So you can see here that each route has a web middleware, but we didn't specify that anywhere. So how does it actually work? How does this web route do that for us? And to understand that, we need to go to the route service provider. So as you have seen before with, as we saw in the previous talk, is that every service provider registers functionality inside Laravel, and there's no difference for the route service provider. So the routes are registered using a service provider, and they add functionality to it. And in this case, we have our own route service provider, and we extend the route service provider from Laravel. And if we scroll a little bit down, we can see here a constant called home, which is basically used for all the authentication controllers that are provided by Laravel if you run the authentication scaffolding. And you can change this to whatever route you want or URL you want, and it will be updated in all those controllers automatically. And the next part is the namespace. And it's now commented out because since Laravel 8, we don't need that namespace anymore. We use this tuple syntax where we register the controller with a method name inside our routes file. And we import the class there or type out the full namespace there. And so it automatically finds the namespace using the class reference. In previous versions, you would use a string version of it. So By default, in previous Laravel versions, you would get this namespace. And we would write out the route like this. So we would have users controller at show. But if we remove the namespace now, Laravel doesn't know where to find the users controller anymore. So that's why we need to specify the namespace. But since Laravel 8, we don't need it anymore, so we can leave it empty and it defaults to null. So if we scroll a little bit more down, then we get this boot method. And this is where the actual magic happens, where all the routes are created. So here we have two groups. We have the API group and we have the web group. And as you can see here, we basically call the group method with the namespace configured and a middleware configured. And for the routes also a prefix, for the API also a prefix. And instead of passing a callback to the group method, we pass in a string, or in this case, a path to a certain file. And Laravel is smart enough to resolve these files for us and put them in that group and register them under that group. So it will apply all the items that are placed on that group to all those routes as well. So that's why we have the web middleware configured to all of our routes automatically. And as said before, the namespace is here null, so we don't do anything with it. So Laravel also offers different ways to register routes in a more way that you probably don't use often, but can be very useful. You can, for example, have a match method where you match on multiple HTTP verbs. So in this case, login, for example, you can use get and post, and it will use the same controller, or in this case, a callback to return a response. So it can be a redirect. It can also be a view, or it can be that you check inside your action what you want to do in there based on the method that's being posted. And in this case, if we run PHP Artisan route list, we can also see all of these methods that are added here. And the same goes for the any option for the routing. And then there are some other things we can do here as well. So you have, for example, have a redirect or permanent redirect we can set here. And so the redirect will just be a 302 HTTP response, and the permanent redirect will be a 301. And as you can see here, it basically registers the same methods as the any method, but the action is different. Instead of using an action we define, we actually use an action that's defined by Laravel. So there's a redirect controller that actually performs the redirect for us and uses this method to determine what it needs to do. So that's very cool that there are actually controllers inside Laravel you normally don't see, but we actually have them there. And the same goes for views. So we can say route view, pass in the view as a second argument, and eventually also add data using the third argument to determine what should be passed to the view as well. And also here, there's a view controller. And eventually we end up with a fallback route. So the fallback route is something you can use if you have no route matching, and then you can return whatever it should be doing there if no route is found. So for example, do a redirect or return a certain view. That's all up to you. And we can do here whatever we want. The cool thing here is that instead of the action being defined by Laravel, they actually define the parameter of the URL. So there's no URL here, there's just a fallback placeholder instead. One important thing, the route fallback should always be at the end of your routes files to make sure that it always returns only, that it always matches the previous routes first and eventually return the fallback. So as said before, we can also reference the routes by their name. So in this case, if we create a route, we can use that name to determine what URL should return. So in this case, we can pass in a number. We can pass in, so if we change the URL here, then we can also, we don't have to change our code anymore. because the route is using the name and the name doesn't change. So if you change the URL, nothing really changes on the route itself. So we can still reference this customers.show name inside our application, but we don't have to worry about what the URL will be. So that's the power of using names. Well, like I said, we can pass in a one, or we can pass in a model, and Laravel is smart enough to always resolve the current primary key of the model as the parameter for the URL in this case. And the same goes for passing in arguments. Laravel will pass in these arguments to the query of the URL if there's no matching found inside the URL itself. And the same goes for if you have no value for the signature in this case, it will just put it on the URL, but without a value. So keep in mind that if you update your URL here, that it will break your application if you add extra parameters in there. So if you would add one extra parameter here, then we actually have to check if all the routes are still correct and if they still have the correct parameters in there. But luckily you can easily find them because you already defined the name. So you can just search on the name and that should be easily done as well. And this route is probably mostly used inside your controllers, views, and probably your middleware for redirects. But it's really powerful because you have that name that's defined everywhere. And here's an example for the controller where we redirect to a certain route. So if a request comes in, we redirect to a certain route using that name, and we pass in the customer model in this case. This works also inside a middleware, for example. So redirect route to dashboard. And then finally, we can also use different ways to determine what kind of route we're actually using at that point. So we can get the current name, we can get the current action, or we can get the current route object. And we will see later on how we create those route objects as well. So this is just basic routing. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We're just going to dive into the routing cycle now. Okay, so did you already order your pizza? I did. Mine is on its way. I just got a text that they started baking my pizza. So I hope you're all good. Okay. So how do we get from a route to a response? And to understand this, we need to understand how the request cycle works. We're not going through the full request cycle, but we're going to touch parts of it. So we first start with making a kernel, and then we call the handle method on the kernel. And in here, we pass in the request as well. So we capture the incoming request. And this kernel is something we already know. This class is, we already use this class for registering our middlewares. So in here, we have 3 variables configured. So we have the middleware group, and the route middleware properties. And each does something with their middleware. So the first one is for registering application-wide middlewares. Then the middleware groups is specifying actual groups like the web and API middleware groups. And then finally, we have the route-specific middleware groups, middlewares. So if we look at those variables, we can see here we have some general middlewares, and they all have a very clear name, so we can see already what they're doing. And these are applied to all the incoming requests. Then we have the middleware group, so we have the web and API. And one different here is that we use 2 different syntaxes. So one is with classes, and the other one is with a string. And the reason we use the string syntax here is because we need to specify a parameter. And we can't really do that with a class, with just a class reference. So that's why there's this throttle API option instead. And this throttle option, or the throttle middleware, is actually defined in the route middleware property. So if we go there, we can see at the bottom the throttle middleware, which is basically a class as well. Okay, so that's very simple. We only need to know that all these middlewares are registered and available. So, and then we can go to the handle method of the kernel, which is stored on the HTTP kernel from Laravel itself. So if you want to click along on all of these slides on the classes, you can see the file path at the top. So you can use that reference to look with me if you want to, or for later reference if you want to. Okay, let's dive in. So the handle method does basically one thing. It converts a request to a response, nothing more, nothing less. But there's a lot of stuff between it. So first we go to the send request through a router method. And in here, we basically see the same slide as we saw in the previous talk, where we actually put the request inside the app instance. So we can use it later on. And this is also a really important thing here, because we're going to update the request later on. So we have to keep doing this all the time. Okay, so we have to request them, and then we call the this bootstrap method. And the this bootstrap method literally starts the framework. So it starts registering configurations, facades, service providers, and so on. So one important thing is that the route service provider is called as well, because we need that to register all the routes. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into the bootstrap method itself, because it will basically just call all the boot and register methods of all the service providers. But we can go to the route service provider now. And so we're back here in the boot method, and this bootstrap method will call this boot method. And in our case, we call this routes. And this routes will do some stuff for us to register our routes. So if we dive a little bit deeper, we can see here that we register the callback on our on the load routes using property. And if we then dive a little bit deeper inside the route service provider from Laravel itself, there's this register method, which is calling the disbooted method. And now it starts to being a little bit more complicated. And remember, we're still inside the bootstrap method of the send request through router method. So we're still inside that kernel class performing this action. And here we can see that Laravel offers two ways. So first we check if there are cached routes, and if they are, we return them. And otherwise we load the route. So if you run php artisan route cache on the command line, a file is generated with all the routes. And this method basically checks, does this a file exist? If so, yes, then load all these routes and return that. Otherwise, we will start loading the routes ourselves. So let's do that. We're going to dive into there. And in here, we see the container stuff. So if the routes, we basically set the route, load routes using, we already set that value to a callback with the routes defined. And in there, we call this app call. And call will basically use the container to call the callback for us. So it also supports dependency injection and so on. So we call the callback, and sorry, I went a little bit too fast. And we perform the callback, and the callback basically has two things in there. We have the route, we call that the route groups. We have the route API group and the route web group. And if we dive a little bit deeper into the router, we can see here that we have the router get method and the post method and so on. So all these methods are being called. So whenever we perform that callback, which with our web.php file and the api.php file, it will basically call all the route get, route post, route patch, route delete, and so on. It will call all of those methods. And inside the router, we will call the add route method. And if we look into the add route method, we basically start creating routes and storing them inside a collection. So that this routes property is a collection of all the routes we created. So let's see what the create route method does for us. So here we generate a generic action for all the routes. And so it's important that we have like a generic route object so we can easily search in it when we try to match a route. So if we look a little bit closer, we have, so the new route method will create a new route object for us. And that's really a simple object for us. And then we look if we have any groups, if the current route is inside a group, and if there is a group available, then we take the attributes of that group and apply them to the current route as well. And eventually we also add where statements. And we didn't go over where statements yet. We will do that later when we look into the route model binding, but these where statements are already applied here. So it will make sure that a certain parameter is validated by the where statement. So what the merge group attributes into routes actually does is making sure that all the prefixes, namespaces, and names are actually added to the route already for the group they belong into. So we eventually end up with a route object, which will be added to the route collection clause. And then basically we have a huge collection of all the routes. But then we actually didn't match a route yet. We just created a collection of all the available routes when booting the framework. We're not even into getting a response at all. So then we go back, because all the routes are loaded now. We can go back to the router. And as you can see in the last few lines, we also refresh the name lookup and we refresh the action lookups. And what those methods basically do is they generate a list of all the available route names and all the available actions inside our router. And this will help us to easily find routes later on. Okay. So we will later see how this collection will be used to match a route. So now we're back in the send request through router method. And after this bootstrap, we basically have a collection of all the routes that are available, but we didn't do anything yet. So the next step is the pipeline. And this is where we send the request, the current request, through the current middlewares of the application. And we only send them to the actual global middleware. So the middlewares that are applied to all routes. So not the route specific or the group specific middlewares. And eventually, if we do that, then we have an updated request object, and we pass that to the dispatch to router method. So that's what we're doing right here. And as you can see here, we set the request again in the container. So the request has been updated because it has run through all those middlewares. So now we can update the route of the container with the current request. And if we did that, we can dispatch the request to the router. So now we're starting to dive in a little bit deeper. Okay, so then we have this method called dispatch to route. And we will first find a route and then run the route. So to find the route, we actually reference the this routes again, which is the route collection we built earlier. And we try to match a route based on this collection. And if we found the route, we put it inside the container. If we go a little bit deeper in finding this route, you will see that we first call this get. And what this get will do for the route collection is actually only grab the routes that have the same HTTP verb. So if we, for example, need a route, we have a post route, it will only grab all the routes that have a post verb available inside our routes collection. So all the get routes, all the put routes, they won't be in there anymore. So it already gives us a smaller list to search for. And then we call the match against route. And in here, well, it's getting complicated here again. Then we have a collection of routes, and then we try to loop over all these routes. And if there is a fallback route, so if the route is a fallback, then we extract it from that collection and put it in its own collection. So that's what the partition method is doing for us. So we basically have two collections now, one with all the post routes and one with all the fallbacks. And then we merge them together again. So this basically makes sure that we put all the fallbacks at the end of the collection. And then we try to find the first route that matches our request. So the fallback will always match because it's a fallback route. So because it's at the end, we always make sure that it will be matched at the end of the loop in this case. So we always try to find the current route first. And if we then look into the matches method on the route object itself, so it checks on itself if it's valid or not. We can see here that we first compile the route to a certain object. So if we look into that method, you can see here that we first create a Symfony route object. And as you might know, Laravel's router is built on Symfony. So that's why we use this to Symfony route and then compile it to a certain object that we can use to determine if the route is correct or not. So we get a compiled route object back. And this is really, those objects are really way more complicated. As you can already see how the Symfony route is created with all this prec replays and all these variables. So there's a lot of going on in there. So now that we have the compiled route, we can start doing checks on it. And in this case, we loop over the validators. So Laravel comes with multiple validators in this case. So if we get to go to that method, get validators, we can see that we have 4 validators. So we have the URI, the method, the scheme, and the host validator. I'm not going to dive into all of those validators, but I think the most important one is the URI validator. And in here, we match the current route against the regular expression from the compiled route. And if we take it a step further, we can see that we get a regular expression generated by the Symfony route object, which matches the current path. And this looks like magic to me. I'm not good at regular expressions, but this is really magic. So if all of these validators pass, we return true because we found the route that we were looking for, and we actually have a route object here. And then we go to the handle match route as well. And in here, we do some more magic. Okay, so first we bind the current request to the route, and we need that to determine what parameters we have for the route. So we will look into that later as well. And if the route is not found, if that's the case, then we throw a not found HTTP exception, which results in a 404 on your screen. So that's why we have this 404 errors if you try to search something on your URL, if you try to open a route that doesn't exist. So if we find a route, we found a match from our routes collection, we put the instance in the container and we return the route. So then we can run the route. So that's getting a little bit more better now. We actually found the route, and Laravel then dispatches the route matched event. So you can catch that and put on a listener to perform a certain action. And then we go to the next step, which is run route within stack, before we can prepare the response. And run route within stack will apply all the other middleware. So if we look into this method, we have this gather route middleware method. That method will basically grab all the middlewares we have for the current route and for its route groups. It will gather them together in one array, and we will then again run the request through each middleware until we can actually perform the route and run it. And eventually that will return a response. So the route run method, this is where the final action happens. So here we have the run controller and run callable actions. And we will look into those methods later as well. So run controller executes the current controller if it's defined, and otherwise we execute the closure of the route. So then we get to the prepare response, because the prepare response gets the current request and it gets the current action that's connected to the route run method. So that's either the response from the controller or the response from the callback. And then we pass all of that to the prepare response. And if we look a little bit closer here, we can see that there's a lot of magic happening here. But in this case, Laravel makes it possible to return whatever you want inside a controller or a callback. So Laravel makes sure that if you return a model, that it's converted to a JSON object, or if you return a collection or an array, that you always get this JSON response back. So that's really powerful. You can return whatever you want in Laravel, and you always get a nice response back. So I really like this part of the framework. So now that we actually have a response, we can bubble up all the way back to the kernel where we started. And now we have a response. So our response object is filled with an actual response, and we return that in the end. And here we can see again, there's another event being fired called request handled. And you can also use that event to determine what should happen if a request is handled. For example, count the number of requests that has been executed by your application, for example. But it's really nice that we have all of these events inside Laravel that you can use to perform some action. Okay, so we have a response. Very cool. So my pizza is still being prepared, so that's really good, I guess. I hope yours is too. So we have a good understanding of how the router works, how we get from registering all these routes and picking a route. But that's not everything routing is. We also have this model binding part, and it's really a core part of the framework. So let's see how that's what's going on there. So if you have a route, we have this airport option. And if we type hint this option, so we can use a controller or a callback, Laravel will automatically resolve the object from the database and return an airport object in this case. And Laravel automatically does that by using the primary key. So if we pass in 1, then the model with ID 1 is returned. If we don't type hint the airport, then Laravel doesn't know what to do, and it will use the normal value. So the type hint here is really important. I mentioned before that we have these where statements, so we can add certain conditions to where parameters. Well, those are applied in this way. So we have this where method where we define the argument name and then the regular expression condition. For example, the Twitter one is that you need to have an @ sign and 15 characters, at most 15 characters. Okay. And Laravel has some extra convenient methods here as well. So like where number, where alphanumeric, or even where UUID. So that's really powerful. And we also have optional arguments. So if you add a question mark behind the argument, then it's marked as optional. And just make sure that you also type in this inside your controller, that it can be nullable, and then you can perform your checks on it if you want to or not. So that's a quick overview of parameters. So there's one more cool feature Laravel has, and I haven't seen this being used a lot, but there's this missing callback we can add. So if the airport cannot be found by Laravel, we can perform a different action. So in this case, we redirect to a certain page, but as you can imagine, there's a lot of options here. And recently, Laravel offers different ways to define the column you want to use to determine what kind of column is used to grab the airport from the database. So in this case, we use the code to grab the airport from the database. And this is a very useful feature. And you can also define this on the model itself instead of inside your route files. So instead, we can define the get route key name. And this can be used as well. By default, this points to the primary key of the model. And this will apply for all your models now if you do it this way. And Laravel also offers different ways inside our route service provider to register a certain key and connect it to a certain model. So in this case, airport or code, they're all connected to the same model. So that's really useful as well. And eventually we can also use a callback to determine our own query. And this is especially useful if you have multiple where statements. And instead of doing this inside your routes file or inside your route service provider, you can also do this on the model. But then it will be applied to all those models, or it will always be applied when doing route model binding for the specific model. Yeah, okay, so to understand what's going on here, we need to understand how this middleware works. So we have this middleware called substitute bindings. And this basically makes route model binding working. So if we disable this middleware, then route model binding doesn't work anymore. So that's really important to understand. So you can't just throw away middlewares and expect things still to work. So if we look into this middleware, we can see two methods, the substitute bindings and the substitute implicit binding. So we have two ways of binding here. So if we look into these methods, we can see that we loop over all the route parameters, which you already defined on the route object. And then we check if the binding exists. And if it exists, we replace the parameter on the route with the correct value. So if there was a 1 before for the user key, we replace it with the user model, for example. And to understand this, we need to take another step back to the route service provider and the route class as well. So if we define this inside our route model or inside our route service provider, we will register this model and bind method first, because the boot method is already called when we call bootstrap inside the kernel. So we will register these actions, so the airport key and the action that's connected to it, in this case, the callback. We register that inside the container so we can reference it whenever we need to. So in this case, we perform binding, and perform binding will actually call this binders action that's connected to the callback we defined in our route service provider. And that's basically what we see here. So in our binders, in the bind method, we put something inside the binders array, and which is in this case is the key, so the user key, and we put the actual action that's connected to it, so the callback to determine what should happen there inside the binders array. And Laravel here offers multiple ways to perform this action. So we have a bind method. We can specify a string pointing to a class and a method, or just passing in a callback. Now, this is where what actually happens if you pass in one of those methods. So the for callback method will try to perform the query for us and resolve things from the container. So it uses the container, so it supports dependency injection to call the method and so on. Okay, so we're back in this method now. And for the for model, basically does the same thing. It creates, we can see it here. So it creates a function, a static function in this case, and it returns a callback, which performs the action to retrieve the model from the database. And that's the only thing we're doing. And if we can't retrieve the model from the database, we throw a model not found exception. And you probably have seen those before as well. So now we're back at why we need to register this first. So these bindings are already registered inside the router, which is stored inside a container. So if we then go back to the router, we can loop over those parameters and check those binders and replace the parameters inside the router. But that's just all for explicit model binding. And we also have implicit model binding. And this is the actual other method that's being called. And we resolve them for the route. So if we dive a little bit deeper here, there's a lot of magic going on here. And there's a lot of code here. So I'm going over it quickly. We have the signature parameters method here that we call on the route. And this will try to grab all the parameters from the current route based on a certain class. In this case, we pass in the URL routable class. And this will call a different method called route signature parameters, and it will call the from action method here. And this is where all the magic is happening to determine what should happen with a certain class. So for example, if we have the user's controller at store method, Laravel will use reflection to determine what kind of parameters this method has. So that's why we also have dependency injection on methods and also on the constructor. So we used reflection to grab all of these parameters, and then we return those, and then we determine what parameters are potentially models. And we use those models to determine if we should retrieve it from the database. So in this case, this from action method returns a full list of parameters that are connected to the method of the class. So if we have the store method and we inject a request and a user model, we get now an array of request and user. If we then go back to this loop where we loop over all these signatures, we can see here that we check if the parameter value is an instance of URL routable. And what this basically means is that every model class implements the URL routable interface. And that's where the resolve route binding and the route model key methods come from. They're all stored inside that interface. And as long as we have that interface, we know it's a model, so we can try to retrieve it from the database. And you see also some reference here to child routes. This has something to do that if you, for example, have a URL user/1/post/1, where the post is connected to the user as well. This is what we call a child route, because the post needs to be connected to the user as well. And that magic is being handled here as well. So now we actually replaced the route. So we actually did some work on the route, and we replaced these parameters on the route object itself. And then we can return that route to the next request, and we updated the request as well. Okay, let me double check my notes. Okay, so to understand what's going on here, and because we now replaced only the parameters, we're not doing anything with the parameters yet. So before we were in the route run method, where we checked if it's a controller or a callable. So we can go back there now. And inside these methods, we actually start calling the controller. So let's go to the run controller method. And this is where a lot of things happen. So first we grab the controller name, and we get the controller class and the controller method name. And we try to execute that against the dispatch method of the controller dispatcher. So if we go a little bit deeper there, we can see here that we have this dispatch method, and we actually call the method that we defined. So if we have the show method on the user's controller, we call the show method, and we pass in all the parameters. One cool thing is that if you have a controller with a call action method, we will actually call that method instead. I'm not sure where that comes from. I think it's from an older Laravel version and that it still exists. But if we have the show method, we basically call the show method on the current controller class and pass in all the parameters. And this is how dependency injection basically works. We resolve all the class method dependencies, and we combine them with the route model bindings we defined. And then we have a big list of all the parameters of a certain controller and of a certain method. And we then put that, then we call it basically. And the return response can be a redirect or a view, whatever works for your controller. So this is basically the deepest part we can get to dispatching a route and actually calling the action. Okay. So is your pizza on its way, guys? I believe mine is on its way, and I hope it will be on time during the talk. I'm not sure yet. It's going to be close. So before we saw that we compiled to a Symfony route object, and the actual URL is compiled based on a regular expression pattern. So let's say we have an application where we have an endpoint that only accepts a JSON object. And in this case, we have an order and we have a message. And the order in this case looks like a URL. we can parse it as a URL as well. And then what it looks like is that we have a certain pattern that we can reuse. So the cool thing about the router is that we can actually do this as well inside our own application. We can reuse this logic from the Symfony router to determine what's going on with the regular expression. So one example would be that there's an application where we broadcast our order to get a pizza. And in this case, we want it from Domino's and we want the Hawaii pizza, but we don't really care what Domino's is doing it for us. We just want to order this pizza. So in here, we have a method where we have the pattern. So we define the pattern and we have the actual value from the request. So we have the order, we have the pattern, and then we have this method called getRouteParameters for pattern. And that's where basically the magic happens. So that's where we can reuse the router. And in this case, the parameters return an array of all the matched parameters from the message we have and from the pattern we defined. So if we go a little bit deeper here, we can see that we reuse the route compiler where we compile a certain route. So in Laravel's case, we first did to Symfony route and then call compile. Basically, this is doing the same thing. So we have a new route object matching a certain pattern, and we want to have that compiled route. And with the compiled route, we can generate a regular expression and match all the found route to a certain parameter and return that. So if we look a little bit close here, we can see that Laravel, in this case, the Symfony router generates this amazing regular expression for our current pattern. And it tries to match against the data in our route. So in this case, the vendor will be Domino's and pizzas will be Margarita. And those values will be returned. And now we can actually use that inside our own class. So we have the vendor and pizza, and we can now actually use them to determine if we can find them or not. So Laravel comes with this router out of the box, and like you can see, you can do a lot of cool stuff with it, and without doing a lot of extra work for it. We actually built this at Amrise for an application where we use the MQTT protocol to send out data, and which is basically a broadcasting system. So we can't define multiple endpoints to retrieve data on there. So instead, we use topics to determine what should happen. But we need to parse the values of these topics to determine what we need to do with the data. And we can listen to everything and we can define multiple topics, but you don't want to create a topic for each model you have. So instead, we have one regular expression used to determine what kind of value should be retrieved from the data. And in this case, the router is perfect for this because we can already reuse this logic it already has. And in our case, we also have, we defined a certain class that uses validation and a certain route pattern to determine what should happen here as well. And so we can reuse these classes, and all the logic is stored inside the base message class. But I think this pattern is really powerful if you reuse these components from Laravel itself. Do some people already have pizza? I don't, sadly. Okay. I got some final best practices. I'm personally not a fan of the above option where you define all these middlewares on each route and use the prefix for teams and so on. It's getting messy really quick. I'm personally a big fan of writing out all these routes myself and only use a few middleware groups. And mostly for middlewares. It could be for namespace as well or for prefixes, but I'm not a big fan of it. And the reason being is that the routes files are basically the documentation of your application. The next time the next developer opens the application, one of the first things they will look into is the routes file. They will use it as a guidance to see what's going on, what kind of functionality is available, and how to get there. And so the routes file should be really structured and should show exactly what you need. So let's say you have multiple routes or you have a lot of routes. You can easily split them into separated files and register them inside your route service provider. We already have this functionality available, so why not use it? And you can also, for example, add an extra middleware for authorization for that special for that middleware for that admin user. So you can use the can admin middleware as well here. So that makes it really easy to add multiple route files as well. Recently, I also built an application where we needed to deploy the application twice. We didn't want to build multiple applications, but just one, where we have the API available as a separated entity on a different server, and we have the regular web application. Well, you can, for example, register only certain routes for that application and only make that functionality available in this case. And that also makes it really powerful. We can still develop everything in one application, but we only allow to use certain routes on certain servers by just using a simple configuration. It can be that simple. Another cool thing is that if you have a route, you can always get the parameter from the current route. And you can also get this from the request. But in this case, if you're defining a certain connection here, you can always go to the parent parameter as well. One important notice with parameters here is that if you define a route with a parameter above another route with a strict URL, in this case user/create, the above one won't work anymore because you can't reach the create route anymore because the parameter is also catching that create. So you need to make sure that those are defined in the correct order. So that's a really good gotcha. And as I said before, we have this, we can get the current route object or the current connected value to the route from the request as well. So if you have route model binding for the user, you can use this method to retrieve the current user as well. And finally, use route caching inside your production environment. It will really speed up your application, and it's just better for referencing as well. Make sure you don't use this locally because it will give you annoying situations where you don't think a route is working because it's actually cached. So, but route caching is really important for your production environment. Okay, so one more pizza. This is the final pizza, I promise. My pizza didn't make it in time, sadly, so I will eat it later. We'll see how that goes. So one final thing. I'm the writer of Laravel Secrets with my friend Stefan. You can get Laravel Secrets with a discount using the Laracon Winter 2021 coupon code. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I hope you enjoy your pizza if you're going to eat them today. And thank you for your time.
All right, great job.
I was a little bit nervous in the beginning, I guess.
No, it went smooth. And that's a lot of code. I mean, nobody can complain they're not getting their Laravel code minimums in this conference. So
it's a really deep dive. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, you were way down in the belly of the beast there. So that's great job.
As promised.
Yes, exactly. All right, thank you.